Hi, everyone. Welcome to a mind-blowing edition of the Cybersecurity Matters podcast. I'm your co-host, Dominic Vogel, and joining me, as always, is Mr. Matrix himself, Christian Redshaw. Christian, how are you doing today?
Doing great. I had a haircut recently, so I'm feeling good. Got my bangs trimmed and ready to rock today. It will be a mind-blowing episode, without a doubt.
You are rocking it as always. But I am very, very curious to know, as always, who is our guest today?
Well, I'm pleased to say it's Malcolm Harkins. So he is a powerful cybersecurity leader, and I have to read his title because I can't remember that many words all in one shot. He's the Chief Security and Trust Officer at a company called Cymatic. I know he talks about leadership. He talks very bluntly about cybersecurity, what works and what really doesn't. So I'm ready to mix it up.
It is very, very cool to have one of the, I'd say, global thought leaders in cybersecurity, in Malcolm here being on the show. You know, I'd say he's one of the more preeminent guests that we've had. So we will pause here, and then we'll bring in Malcolm shortly.
Let's do it. All the way from Sacramento, California, it is Malcolm Harkins. We are so glad to have you on the show today. Welcome, Malcolm.
Hey, thanks. Happy to be here.
Awesome. So let's start general, and then we'll drill down into specifics and hopefully find whatever bee might be buzzing around in your bonnet today. Our podcast is called Cybersecurity Matters, and I want to ask, why does cybersecurity matter for organizations? When we're thinking about framing risk, we're thinking, why does it matter in the minds of business leaders, not just for financial loss to an organization, but around the importance to, their clients and then, society as a whole? What is the big picture of why cybersecurity is important?
Well, I'll start first with a little bit of data that will say that cybersecurity doesn't matter. And it's data based upon an investment philosophy that I should have probably invested in years ago and never did, that I call BOB. BOB stands for buy on breach. If you look historically at every major data breach that's been disclosed, by and large, there's no long-term shareholder degradation of shareholder value. Short-term sell-off, emotional, but no long-term shareholder decline. And so from that perspective, it doesn't matter if your job is to grow shareholder value in the long term. And the other thing that I would submit that also is a thing for most business leaders that provide lip service to cybersecurity versus really focusing on it is the fact that the National Association of Corporate Directors a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, did a survey of corporate directors and asked them a wide variety of questions. One of the questions was on cybersecurity. 61% of corporate directors said they would compromise on cybersecurity for a business objective. So despite all the lip service, I would say most executives don't care about cybersecurity. It doesn't matter. Now, here's why it should matter. Every company is becoming a technology company. They have an app, they have a website. They're embedding technology into devices. They're embedding technology into their buildings. And the consequence of that, if we continue the path that we're on, is one of a societal risk. Even the World Economic Forum over the past several years has put cyber risk not only as the number one business risk, but it's a societal risk up there with climate change, income disparity, polarization of society. And frankly, it's time we get our head out of our ass and drive a level of accountability at the executive level and to the people in charge of security internally, and hold the security industry accountable to doing a better job.
I was going to say that's just really such an interesting and very powerful, like better opening statement there, Malcolm. Showing those two almost use cases. I want to dive into the what you were saying there in terms of why it doesn't matter, and that's just so interesting with what you were saying there. In terms of that mindset, and again, I'd like to even drill down in terms of why that mindset is pervasive and why that was the case. Does this historically go back to the fact that cybersecurity's roots was traced back to IT, and for many executives, IT is a source of black magic, and therefore it's out of sight, out of mind? How did we come to this point where it doesn't matter in their eyes?
Well, it gets down to bottom line impact, right? If I'm in a public company, right, and there's no long-term shareholder degradation, and my responsibility is shareholder value. Yeah, I might have a problem that I have to spend $50 or $100 million, hire a post-breach CSO to come in, pay them a ton of money, and I've had some cash drain. But if my stock is up 20, 30, 40, a couple 100% a year or so after the breach, there's no real impact. CEO gets fired and they have a 40, 50, 60, $100 million exit package. They don't feel any personal harm, right? CISO gets paid out to leave because they're the fall person. So the economics of the problem, not only for the industry itself, who makes money on, so again, there's two economic issues. There's the economics of the industry that profits from the insecurity of computing, right? And so economically, if more risk grows, the industry makes more money at a macroeconomic level. The industry doesn't have an economic incentive to really solve the problem. Hence the feature economy and the Band-Aid, bubblegum, baling wire. Hence the marketing machinery perpetuating failed controls. Hence the public policy arm of some security companies perpetuating a compliance regime towards dated technology that doesn't work. And then you look at the economics of the business. If I'm spending money on security, it doesn't grow my revenue. It takes away from my net income. It takes away from my margin. And then further, security and controls impede business velocity because controls create friction. Friction impedes business velocity, right? Which is why people go around the controls. And then the security industry says, we're going to sell you more solutions to deal with rogue IT and rogue vendors. And you go, do they have an incentive to remove friction and improve business velocity? No, right? So it's all frankly effed up in the economic incentives. And being a former finance guy and an economist by background, I look at it and I go, until we approach this as an economics issue and look at the economics of the industry and change the incentive structures so that people who've sold controls that don't work get punished in the marketplace for it, not just this long tail of a death spiral by people nipping at their heels. And then change the economic incentives for organizations where there's real accountability, which is one of the reasons why I've been advocating, at least for the past year or so, the equivalent of Sarbanes-Oxley law for cybersecurity. Let's have the corporate officers attest to the integrity of their controls. And when their attestation is wrong, there's personal liability as well as corporate implications for that would affect the shareholders and them.
Yeah, which is interesting from a reputational perspective, but then it again ties back into the insurance industry, which we haven't talked about yet today, but the idea, okay, you have cyber liability, well, then that, gets into the professional liability and whatever else. So, directors and officers, professional liability. It becomes an ugly mess. But I like what you're saying there in terms of the accountability. I think that's such an important piece that it lacks if in your point of view the economics don't work out. What would you say? Like, I'm hoping we have a silver lining somewhere in this. What would you say then would be like a good way to, people often say balance, functionality and the operations of an organization versus cybersecurity, and maybe a better word for that is, can you have both? Can you optimize both?
Well, and I'm glad you brought that up. And again, it's I hate the word balance. If you look at a balance beam, one goes up, one goes down, right? You're making trade-offs. We do this because it's the context of the framework that we're using to frame the problem. I've always looked at my role running security as that of a choice architect. I'm architecting choices for the business, right? Some of those choices I get to make, some of the CIO does, some of the business unit general manager, some of the CEO or board does. But when I look at my choice architecture and how I frame my choices, I look at risk through three lenses. Risk to the business, which the business might say, I can take it, no long-term shareholder degradation. Risk to my customer, well, that's brand damage. That might make me a little bit more concerned. And then perhaps societal risk, right? Something pervasive. So three lenses to risk is one way to frame it to drive a different dialogue. But getting back to balancing between cost and quality, security versus privacy, security versus functionality. Again, when you trade off, one goes up, one goes down. The framing we should be using is that of a calculus equation. They're all coefficients in this equation. It's a design and architectural challenge to maximize the coefficients of each one. If you start from a trade-off perspective, you're always going to decline one and increase the other. If you start saying, my role is to optimize these things, you'll do the harder architectural work to focus on the risks, the total costs of controls, and the friction those controls have on the business. And then you're going to push your team, the industry, and yourself to do the harder work to weed and feed your environment of the crap that actually is increasing your total cost and not solving your risk and getting in way of the business velocity. And so there's a whole control philosophy, control strategy that I've written into my books and stuff that I call my 9 box of controls. I think if we can get people to have that type of holistic business risk mindset and frame the functionality right, and frankly, hold the CISO accountable to doing a business role in addition to the risk role, and then hold the board and the executives accountable to not only the business outcome, but the risk outcomes, that will then force a change because they'll be buying and acting differently, which will then force the economic change onto the security marketplace itself.
And I think another aspect to that is the managing and the identifying, managing, reducing of the risk versus just reacting to it, which again ties back to those drivers that you laid out there.
Yeah, or another view that I have, and again, we take this a little bit out of the cyber context. Obviously, we've been in a pandemic situation for a year and some. Drives me nuts that so many people were like, "Oh my God, who could have thought this would have occurred?" And I'm like, "What was your damn job? To contemplate risk and manage it. It was a certainty it would occur again, and if you weren't prepared for it, shame on you."
That's so powerful, Malcolm. And I love that term, choice architect. By the way, I'm still processing that term. It's so eloquent and yet so descriptive. And I want to just get your thoughts. And we're talking again, at least initially, that publicly traded enterprise level. What does it look like then at maybe a small, mid-sized business level? Is cyber risk more of an existential risk there? Does the Bob methodology still apply there? Curious how that's different at maybe the SMB level compared to enterprise.
Yeah, it's a great question. And having been at some small and medium businesses since I left Intel, right? Because I've been in security startups and I know a bunch of friends that do virtual CISO work and stuff like that in the SMB space. There's probably a higher level of acuteness to what I'll call an extinction event that could occur for an SMB, right? That cataclysmic event that, really put you out of business. One could be, you're a small light manufacturing organization and your factory gets ransomed. I mean, you're dead if you don't manufacture. You might not have the cash to pay. It could be a going out of business scenario. You're probably not going to go out of business because of a data loss that affects personal information. You might have to defend some type of consumer class action, but that'll only occur if you're big enough and a plaintiff's attorney thinks you're worth the time, right? And they don't want to kill you; they just want to extract a toll, the equivalent of legal ransomware, right? So in that sense, there's an impact that really could create that existential threat. Or think of business email compromise. And you drain the cash enough that that SMB can't make payroll. They can't cover the benefits costs for their employees. Their accounts receivable are too far out. That really could create again a level of precariousness for sustainability of the business. So I think in the SMB space, the acuteness of pain and the impact is greater.
Okay, well, I appreciate that insight. I just have one more quick question before I hand over to Christian to bring it home. But you mentioned the pandemic, and in terms of this past year and what we've seen, the rise of working from anywhere. Why that maybe at a conceptual level, are we moving into a new security paradigm? What in terms of new emergence in terms of security, not necessarily from a technology point of view, but maybe in terms of how we view security from a risk perspective. What are we looking at moving forward in terms of a security, like I say, in that working from anywhere paradigm?
Well, to be honest, it's an interesting thing. And again, having grown up at Intel creating the Centrino platform, the first wireless, laptop and stuff like that. My team was worldwide. We worked 24/7. I worked from anywhere, and I have for years. I was on bridges and video conference meetings. Heck, I'd have my own conference room, and I'd be the only one in it because everybody was every place else, right? So for the people that are there's certain businesses that you have to be on-prem for, right? Manufacturing, nursing, a store, stuff like that. Everything else, the people that were holding on to on-prem work, there are current arcane management philosophies will die off or should have died off years ago. And people need to let go of it. Now, when you start thinking about that, then you go, okay, is the attack surface really that different? To some extent it is, but if you already had employees that had a level of mobility because they had a phone, a laptop, and occasionally did email and stuff like that, their home was already at risk and causing a risk issue for the enterprise because they'd VPN in and stuff like that. The amount of work they're doing at home now is changing. But I go, if they're now going, oh my God, I've got a work anywhere situation, when 50% of their work they had mobility, I'm like, you had your head up your ass. You already had that situation. Why didn't you manage it? So why are you panicking about it now, right? So I'm a little bit hard on this, as you can see, because I think the problem we have is that we always shoot looking backwards, and our risk focus is so myopic to the things biting me in the ass today. And versus thinking out, and I think we can nudge. So I have this concept that I call risk nudge, right? Again, think of that asteroid, the extinction event. It's so far out. Your job is to contemplate risk and then manage it. Well, if you can contemplate risk a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years down the road, again, former finance guy, strategic planner, right? You can nudge out of the path by just making small, minute decisions now for things that are probable down the road. And then it's not a cataclysmic event, right? And so it's that's why I go, it's a choice architecture. It's a contemplation of risk. It's It's really having a wide angle view and that ability to focus in at a microscopic level in a subsecond and then walk back out and look at the entire universe and juxtapose those things all the time. And if you're not doing it, you're frankly not doing your leadership role. You're tactically managing.
You know, I get the last question here, and I'm going to try to put two questions into one, and then Malcolm, you can bring us home with the answer to this. But I'm sitting here pondering, what should we call this episode? Should it be holding executives and boards accountable, or get your head out of your ass? Trying to balance both of those things, and it is that balance equation again. But my two questions into one. When you're looking at the people are the perimeter, I know you've talked quite a bit about this before, and you also talk about leadership. So putting those two together, what is the role of a leader when it comes to cybersecurity at the top level and then throughout, and then how important are the people in cyber defenses?
Yeah, great question. So I used to teach when I was back at Intel, the Leadership Challenge, which is a book from Kuznets and Posner, professors at Santa Clara. It's all around behaviors and traits and stuff like that. And they had one of the best definitions of leadership in that book that I've always focused on. Leadership is the art of mobilizing others to want to struggle for shared aspirations. This is the challenge. It's a struggle to do our jobs day in and day out because of the two battlefields we face. The external one, right, which we talk about, threat actors and threat agents and all that other stuff. But there's another battlefield that's the internal battlefield of budgets, bureaucracies, and behaviors. And that's a grind too, right? So we have to mobilize our teams to want to persist and persevere, beat their head against the wall on both of those all the time. Risk management's a contact sport. It's like playing hockey, right? You check people in the glass. Why? So they know you're there. It's not a spectator sport. And if you're not on the field, you're not on the ice, and you're not playing with full contact, you're not doing your damn job, right? That's the CISO, CSO leadership role. But at the same time, and my whiteboard back behind me is a leadership framework that I've developed for a future book. The way in which you sustained that is through 6 things that I have a service mark on these 6 words. I believe, I belong, I matter. If you can create a culture in your team and then expand it through the rest of your organization, because you can connect the dots between your security actions and the business objectives, you can have your team routinely say, I believe in the management, I believe in the mission, I believe in myself, and I believe in the team. I feel like I matter because the security work we do makes a difference, and the organization that we support realizes that. And then, you feel like you matter because of the impact that you can have. So you've got to connect the security mission to the business mission, right? To get that linearity of belief, that linearity of belonging, and that linearity of the actions that the security team does matters to the business, matters to their customers, and matters to society. I think if you do that, you can solve all those problems.
That's an incredibly epic way of ending this podcast, Malcolm. I know Christian and I could honestly listen to you for hours. Like you're such a wealth of knowledge, and just this has been an absolute delight and treat listening to you for the better part of 20, 25 minutes here. Like, this has just been truly a masterclass and on all sorts of levels. We're very, very appreciative of your time today. And I know our viewers and listeners are just going to be blown away by the awesomeness of this episode.
I'm happy to be here, and thanks for inviting me. And if any of your readers or listeners, want to chat, ping me. I love to talk to people. I'm harsh on my views at times, but people always know what I think, and they know where I stand and why I stand there.
Love it.
We love it, Malcolm. Thank you again so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us today. And Christian and I will be back momentarily to wrap up today's episode. That was such an engaging conversation, Christian. I mean, I think I could have listened to Mark speak for another 2.5 hours. Like, he is just a wealth of knowledge, really engaging speaker. Very curious to what your key takeaway was from his thoughts today.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think, he could have gone on and on. I know there was a lot of depth in that well for us to pull on. And so it is a shame that we had to end it when we did. But what stands out to me is his experience from an incident response perspective, from walking hand in hand with organizations that are, the house is burning around them. They're in the midst of a data breach, a cyber attack, and they just are confused. They don't know what to do. They haven't planned. And so what we can take from that is, when the house is burning down is not the time to call a cybersecurity expert or call a digital forensics firm. Although if you haven't done anything beforehand, yes, it is the time to do that. But a better time would have been, a week ago or a month ago or a year ago. Have an incident response plan, and you will know who's doing what and when and why.
Yeah, and that's so well said there, Christian. And for me, I think my key takeaway was he was really, I think Mark did a really great job of talking about the practical and pragmatic steps that small and mid-sized organizations can take. And this isn't rocket science or taking apart a jet engine, which Mark is fully qualified to do. but so I really appreciate him really laying that out in very clear, very concise steps for our listeners and viewers. And speaking of which, we're always grateful to our amazing loyal listeners and viewers, and we want to make sure that we thank them, as well as thank Mark for joining us today. As always, please do check out previous podcasts on the Cybersecurity Matters podcast YouTube page, as well as other podcasts that fly under the Conversations That Matter banner, which can also be found on YouTube. But until next time, be well, be safe, and we will catch you next time on the Cybersecurity Matters podcast.